May 27, 1541. The Tower of London loomed, a grim sentinel under a sky that seemed to weep with a silent dread. Within its formidable walls, not a boisterous crowd, but a small select group gathered, bearing witness to a private, chilling spectacle. In the tower green, a low wooden block stood, awaiting its grim purpose. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and unspoken fear. A hushed anticipation clung to the scene as guards brought forth a woman, her silver hair a stark contrast to the somber surroundings. Her name was Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, and the last surviving Plantagenet. Her face, etched with the resilience of 80 years, betrayed a flicker of dismay, contemplating the instrument of her death. In moments, she would face an execution as rare as it was haphazard. She would be beheaded, feeling the bite of the axe, not with the swift certainty of a practiced hand, but with repeated, agonizing blows. How did a noble woman of such stature end up condemned to such a terrible fate? To understand this macabre story, we must turn back the clock several years. The 1530s, England was experiencing one of the most turbulent periods in its history. King Henry VIII was determined to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon to wed Anne Boleyn. This decision divided the kingdom, tearing at the very fabric of society. On one side stood ambitious courtiers who supported the king's desire, eager to gain favor and influence. On the other, conservative clerics and staunch loyalists to the old order, who considered marriage sacred and indissoluble, and who saw the king's actions as a betrayal of God and tradition. Among the latter was Margaret Pole, a woman of deep religious convictions and direct lineage to the Plantagenet kings. Her very existence, a living connection to a deposed dynasty, became a source of increasing unease for Henry VIII, particularly as his grip on power became more absolute and his reforms more radical. Margaret, a revered figure in her own right, had earned the enmity not only of Henry VIII, but also of the Boleyn family, who saw her as a potential rallying point for dissent against their ascendancy. The Countess lived in constant apprehension, fully aware of the precariousness of her position, especially after the downfall of her son Reginald Pole, who openly defied the king from abroad. Her paranoia, as we shall see, was not unjustified. At Warblington Castle, her family seat, Margaret maintained a life of quiet dignity, but under constant surveillance. The Countess was not particularly remarkable in her daily routines. An ordinary noblewoman whose life revolved around prayer, managing her household, and tending to her family. Yet her lineage set her apart from the mass of subjects who navigated the shifting tides of Tudor politics. Discreet and devout, she had never given direct reason for suspicion until the fateful events surrounding her family began to unfold. Margaret's eldest son, Henry Pole, Lord Montague, and her grandson, Henry Courtenay, the Marquess of Exeter, were implicated in the Exeter Conspiracy, a supposed plot against Henry VIII. In late 1538, these accusations, largely fabricated and fueled by Thomas Cromwell's machinations, led to their arrest and subsequent execution for treason. The king, upon learning of the alleged conspiracy, was furious. Although Margaret herself had committed no direct act of treason, her family's involvement, especially that of her rebellious son Reginald, who had become a cardinal and fierce critic of the king, sealed her fate. The very name Pole, and especially Plantagenet, became a symbol of potential opposition to the Tudor dynasty. The monarch ordered an immediate investigation, and Margaret Pole, despite her age and infirmity, was arrested in November 1538 and taken to the Tower of London. There, she was subjected to constant interrogation, not for her own actions, but for the perceived disloyalty of her sons. Under immense pressure, she maintained her innocence, asserting her loyalty to the king. Surprisingly, the case did not follow normal legal procedures. Margaret Pole was condemned by an act of attainder in May 1539, a legislative act that allowed Parliament to declare a person guilty of treason without a trial. This was a tactic increasingly employed by Henry VIII and his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, to dispose of inconvenient individuals swiftly and without the inconvenience of presenting concrete evidence. This fact deserves special attention. Henry VIII not only determined Margaret's guilt without a proper trial, but also retrospectively used the actions of her family to justify her condemnation. The penalty for treason was already terrible. The condemned was usually hanged, drawn, and quartered. But the king wanted something more. Something that would equate to the threat she represented. A slow erosion of her dignity and life, culminating in a brutal public end. Why such cruelty? Why the king's personal involvement in a case that, although serious, involved an elderly woman who posed no direct military threat? The motives were never fully clarified. Some historians suggest that Henry VIII had a genuine paranoia about his throne, seeing any Plantagenet blood as a potential claimant and a threat to his hard-won authority. Others, more skeptical, see more complex political motivations. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of many of Henry's more ruthless policies, saw Margaret as a prime target, a symbol of the old nobility and Catholic loyalties that stood in the way of the king's religious reforms and the consolidation of his power. The imperial ambassador Eustace Chapais, a keen observer of the English court, suggested in correspondence that Margaret's execution was a direct reprisal for her son. Reginald Pole's continued defiance from abroad. The swift and spectacular condemnation of the entire Pole family could serve to send a clear message. No one, regardless of birth or age, was safe from the king's wrath if they opposed his will. Whatever the truth, Margaret Pole's fate was sealed. Her execution was set for May 27, 1541. Such an unusual event drew a small, solemn assembly to the Tower Green. Few pushed to get a good viewing angle. Street vendors were absent, for this was no theatrical spectacle, but the atrocious end of an elderly noblewoman. The low wooden block stood ready when Margaret was brought forth. Accounts suggest she maintained her composure, a final act of defiance for one who would receive no other. The guards led her to the block. A prayer was quickly recited by a priest, offering absolution for her sins, but no relief for her body. What followed was one of the most horrifying executions recorded in English history, not for its grandiosity, but for its clumsy brutality. The executioner, reportedly a novice or simply unskilled, struck the first blow. It landed not cleanly on her neck, but on her shoulder, causing her to rise from the block and cry out in pain. The second blow, equally poorly aimed, struck her head. Margaret, bleeding and disoriented, stumbled. Her attempts to rise met with further desperate hacks from the executioner. It took several more blows before her head was finally severed. A macabre and drawn-out spectacle of incompetence and suffering. Death, though horrible, finally freed her from her torment. Margaret Pole's execution was not an isolated case. The reign of Henry VIII was marked by a relentless campaign against real and perceived enemies, culminating in a series of executions that solidified his tyrannical rule. This method of eliminating political opponents, particularly by attainder and without due process, became a chilling characteristic of his later years. What makes Margaret Pole's case particularly disturbing is not just the brutality of her punishment, but the political circumstances surrounding it. She was a victim of a volatile historical moment when England stood on the threshold of monumental religious and political changes. Her ancient lineage a dangerous anachronism in a king's quest for absolute power. Thomas Cromwell, the man who orchestrated her downfall, would not escape his own tragic fate. Just a year before Margaret's execution, in 1540, Cromwell himself was executed on charges of treason, accused of overreaching his authority and manipulating the king. His head, like those of so many others, was displayed on London Bridge. Anne Boleyn, whose rise to the throne was indirectly related to the reshaping of the English court and the king's ruthlessness, would not enjoy a happy ending either. In 1536, just 5 years before Margaret's death, she herself would be executed on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, all widely considered fabrications to allow Henry to marry his third wife, Jane Seymour. As for Henry VIII himself, He would continue his turbulent reign for another 6 years, marrying 3 more women, breaking definitively with Rome and transforming England into a Protestant country. His paranoia and brutality would only increase with age, leaving a trail of blood that would forever mark English history. Today, the site where Margaret Pole met her terrible end is a quiet lawn within the Tower of London, marked by a simple memorial. Few visitors passing daily through the Tower Green know that beneath their feet centuries ago, a dignified noblewoman met a horrific, drawn-out end, a casualty of a king's relentless pursuit of power. The story of Margaret Pole offers us a disturbing glimpse into the past. It reminds us of a time when justice and cruelty went hand in hand, when the powerful could literally rewrite laws to satisfy their whims, and when the value of human life was determined by the political utility of one's death. It is impossible to determine today whether Margaret Pole was truly guilty of anything more than her Plantagenet blood and her unwavering Catholic faith, or whether she was simply a scapegoat to cover up a larger conspiracy against her son Reginald. What we know with certainty is that her punishment exceeded any sense of justice, even by the brutal standards of her time. Execution by a blundering axe, a death that lacked even the swiftness of a practiced hand. Margaret Pole's nobility carries a macabre irony that cannot be ignored. The woman whose life was dedicated to upholding ancient traditions ended her days as a brutal example of a new, absolute power. It is a punishment that suggests not just the elimination of a perceived threat, but a terrible, symbolic vengeance that aimed to satisfy the insatiable desire for control of a more brutal era. 5 centuries have passed since that May morning in the Tower Green. The world has changed in ways that Henry VIII and his contemporaries could hardly imagine. Our justice systems, though imperfect, now seek rehabilitation more than retribution. Our laws are supposedly applied equally to the powerful and the common. Our punishments, even for the most heinous crimes, do not include deliberate torture or prolonged agony. Nevertheless, the story of Margaret Pole, the last Plantagenet executed by Henry VIII, continues to fascinate us. Precisely because it shows us how thin the line is that separates civilization from barbarism, and how institutions that should protect citizens can easily become instruments of terror when manipulated by those in power. Under the hurried feet of modern tourists, the echoes of the past still resonate. And if we listen carefully, perhaps we can still hear the cries of a proud countess who on a grey May day in 1541 discovered in the most terrible way what it means to be on the wrong side of a king's wrath.